America 250, The Dogs, Episode 4, Builders of a New Nation. Welcome to America 250, The Dogs. America declared independence from Great Britain in 1776. But declaring independence and building a nation were two very different things. The Revolutionary War still had to be fought. A government still had to be created. Cities had to be built. Territories organized. Frontiers settled. The United States existed on paper long before it fully existed in practice. In our last episode, we followed the paper trail of colonial America through newspapers, tax records, and legal documents. Today, we follow the builders, the soldiers, the settlers, the pioneers, and the dogs that went with them. The fight for independence changed everything. War was not a distant event discussed in newspapers. It was immediate, personal, disruptive. Farms became supply depots. Roads became military routes. Cities became battlegrounds. Families found themselves caught between armies and uncertainty. The 13 colonies had become 13 states. But independence did not bring stability overnight. For the people living through it, this wasn't history, it was survival. And through all of that uncertainty, dogs remained. Not as symbols, not as mascots, but as workers, protectors, and companions. They guarded homes left vulnerable by war, traveled alongside soldiers, followed families forced to relocate, stayed close when everything else seemed to be changing. One of the more unusual figures of the Revolution was General Charles Lee. A senior officer in the Continental Army, Lee was known as much for his eccentric personality as for his military service. And he loved dogs. In many accounts, he seemed to prefer their company to that of other people. Several dogs traveled with him throughout his military career, but one stood out above the rest. A small dog named Spado. Contemporaries describe Spado as compact and almost bear-like in appearance. The dog accompanied Lee almost everywhere. He rode with him, ate near him, slept close enough that visitors frequently commented on the ever-present smell of dogs surrounding the general. At one dinner gathering, Lee reportedly instructed Spado to offer his paw and shake hands with guests. But perhaps the strongest evidence of their bond came after Lee's capture by the British in 1776. Separated from his companions and held as a prisoner, Lee wrote requesting that his dogs be brought to him. Among the many concerns of war, one of the things he missed most was their company. In a world built on military rank, discipline, and protocol, Lee was an outlier. His dogs were not. They were there in the camps, on the roads, in the uncertainty, like countless others whose names were never recorded, because even during a revolution, daily life continues. It simply adapts, and so did the dogs. The war officially ended in 1783. Independence had been secured. Now came the harder part, building a nation. The Constitution would follow. Territories would be organized. a federal government would take shape. The capital would eventually move from Philadelphia to a new city on the Potomac River, Washington, D.C., a city that at the time was still little more than a construction project. The United States wasn't simply growing, it was learning how to function. And as the nation expanded, people moved across mountains, into forests, toward opportunity, toward farmland, toward a future they hoped to build. And once again, they didn't go alone. Dogs traveled with them. Not in military camps this time, but in wagons, settlements, and newly established homesteads. They guarded property that didn't yet feel secure, helped hunt unfamiliar game, warned families of approaching danger, and stood watch while communities took shape. The role of the dog was changing, still practical, still necessary, but now increasingly connected to permanence, to home, to family. One man who reflected that shift was Thomas Jefferson. Unlike John Adams, who brought his dogs to the president's house, Jefferson did not bring dogs to the White House. But dogs remained an important part of his life. At Monticello, Jefferson kept and bred Briards, a French herding breed that reflected his well-known admiration for French culture. Among them were dogs named Grizzle and Bergère. These were not military dogs, not frontier dogs, not war companions. They represented something else: intentional breeding, selection, purpose, a growing interest in shaping dogs for specific traits and identities. In many ways, Americans were beginning to define their dogs at the same time they were defining their nation. But Jefferson's connection to dogs extended well beyond Monticello. In 1803, he authorized one of the most famous expeditions in American history, the Lewis and Clark expedition. And one member of that expedition had 4 legs, a large black Newfoundland named Seaman. Chosen for strength, intelligence, and endurance, Seaman accompanied Meriwether Lewis across thousands of miles of territory. For 3 years he traveled through mountains, forests, rivers, and landscapes few Americans had ever seen. He hunted, stood guard, warned of danger, and survived hardships that would have ended many lives. Today, statues of Seaman stand across this country, but his full story is still ahead, and we'll follow that in our next episode. By the early 19th century, the United States was accelerating. New states joined the Union. Settlements pushed westward. Roads and rivers became pathways into unfamiliar territory. The country was growing faster than many people could fully understand, and through all of it, dogs continued doing what they had always done, living close to people, eating what the household ate, sleeping where they were needed, moving when families moved. There were few clear lines between work and life. Dogs existed within both. On the frontier, their value often came down to one thing: awareness. Before a branch snapped in the darkness, before an animal approached camp, before danger revealed itself, the dog often knew first. A stiff posture, raised ears, a low growl, a sudden alertness, those small warnings mattered. On the frontier, they could mean the difference between safety and disaster. As Americans moved farther west, many dogs found themselves returning to roles their ancestors had known for thousands of years: tracking, guarding, hunting, surviving. Early hounds laid the foundation for breeds that would eventually become the American foxhound and various coonhound lines. Cur dogs proved versatile enough to hunt, guard, and adapt to nearly any situation. These were not dogs bred for status. They were bred for function, for reliability, for survival. Most of their individual names have been lost to history, but records suggest the names people chose were often simple and familiar: Jack, Hunter, Scout, Sam, Molly, Sally, Lucy, Belle, Daisy. Names spoken across cabins, campsites, and small settlements. Not grand, not symbolic, just part of everyday life. Because by this point, dogs were no longer simply helping Americans survive. They had become part of the household itself, part of daily routines, part of family stories, part of America. In just a few decades, the United States had transformed from a fragile new nation struggling for independence to a country pushing steadily westward. New states, new territories, new opportunities, and new questions about what the country would become. But throughout those changes, one thing remained remarkably consistent: where people went, dogs went too. From military camps during the Revolution to construction sites in the new capital, to cabins standing at the edge of the frontier, they were there, not always recorded, not always remembered, but always present, working, watching, protecting, adapting, and preparing for the next chapter. Because in our next episode, one of those dogs steps out of the background and into the spotlight. A dog who would travel thousands of miles across a continent that was still being explored. A dog named Seaman. Thank you for listening to America 250, The Dogs. Join me next time as we follow the remarkable journey of Seaman and the Lewis and Clark expedition into the American West. Because as this nation expanded, we were a pack. I'm Andrea LaGrow, and I'll see you next time.